Hi, welcome to this short video on health and safety awareness at the workplace. Initially, I'll start by saying this is based on our UK legal system, which is associated to our statutory requirements of law, both on employers and on employees. We refer to this as the statute law, our regulations, our ACOPs, codes of practice, and the guidance notes around this. We have significant different legal requirements within our law, which guides us and outlines our basic requirements as employers and employees. And this starts with the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. And this applies to both employers and employees, and also aligns with the requirements to self-employed individuals. And it's associated to the health and safety provisions we put in place, the amendments and the previous laws which were there, and associated regulations that we have to follow. We also have to think of the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999, which places duties on our employers. These are associated to, for example, the requirements to make suitable and sufficient assessment of risks to our employees in the workplace arising from the work activities that we do. Put in place adequate controls to ensure that the measures we have either eliminate or minimise those hazards. And it's appropriate that we must record these if we employ more than 5 people. The management regulations also ensure that we have to have competent persons undertaking the work tasks that we give them. So this is associated to training and competence assessment to ensure that our people understand the tasks they have to take. As well as that, we have to establish and give effect to the procedures that must be followed in the event of a serious or imminent danger. This may be associated to fire emergency plans or similar. We must nominate competent persons to implement appropriate measures in the situation where there may be emergency situations. For example, fire emergency and evacuation requirements. It's also important that where required, we must undertake health surveillance activities to ensure that as part of our risk assessments, that we are not causing any undue problems in ill health or safety concerns to our employees. We must also recognise that there is, under the Health and Safety at Work Act, general duties on our employees, and it's important that our employees understand this, that they must take reasonable care for their own health and safety and the health and safety of others, which could be affected by the work that they undertake or the emissions of not doing something that they are meant to be doing. They have to cooperate with their employer in their efforts to comply with the requirements of the duties under this Act, and they must ensure not to be intentionally or reckless in interfering or misuse of anything that's provided to provide support around the management of health and safety. As well as this, we must, as employees, follow the requirements on the use of any equipment provided to us for the safe manner it is due to be used. We also must ensure that we do not cause any harm by tampering with any safety devices, and must comply with all the training and instructions that are provided to us, not cutting corners and not causing human error. We must report any issues and carry out the work that's presented to us to ensure that we do not bring about any serious danger for which it could impact others. As part of our requirements by law, we must understand what our hazards and risks are within our workplace. The understanding of a hazard is the inherent ability of any article or substance or activity that could cause harm to a person or property. The risk is the probability of that hazard actually causing harm and the extent that that harm may cause. So, as part of our requirements as an employer, we must undertake risk assessments, and in doing so, it's suggested that we follow 5 basic risk assessment steps. Hazard evaluation, identify who may be harmed, evaluate the risk, record the findings, and review those where necessary. You may want to consider looking at one of our other YouTube videos and blogs associated to some guidance around more details in undertaking risk assessments. We must also recognise, under the definition of the law, that we must manage accidents and incidents, plan for them, and the controls we put in place if such an event occurs. The definition is an accident can be defined as an undesired and uncontrolled event which results in physical harm or property damage. A near miss is an unplanned event that did not result in injury, illness or damage, but had the potential to do so. So various causes of accidents are generally driven by unsafe acts and unsafe conditions. The unsafe acts are normally undertaken by people, and these unsafe acts could be intentional or based on a lack of knowledge. Unsafe conditions may be related to the environment that we're working in, the equipment that we're asked to use, or other supporting activities around that. The principles of our accident and incident prevention should be around the elimination of the hazards first and foremost, the management of the risks that we undertake, and of course associated to our behaviours and attitudes so that we influence our employees and colleagues to do the right thing, to prevent accidents and incidents occurring. When such a situation arises, then we must form a method of investigation to establish whether a reoccurrence can be prevented and whether the effects by what we have learned may need additional control measures put in place. Further areas as employers that we have to be aware of is first aid, the provision of treatment for the preservation of life until medical attention is given, and to treat minor injuries which could otherwise not require any detailed or significant treatment. The duties of an employer is to ensure that they provide first aid. Every employer must provide the necessary equipment and facilities which are adequate for their place of work and the work they undertake, and therefore appropriate in the circumstances for administering first aid to its employees and any visitors to their site. And they must ensure that they communicate this information appropriately to people coming onto their site, whether they be employees or visitors. Likewise, they must provide trained first aiders. These first aiders must be notified that they are the people that are appointed by the company to provide this support, and this named person should be known, or persons should be known by everyone in the business and nominated typically on a first aid sign so that visitors are also aware. Now let's talk about personal protective equipment. So what we mean by this is it's equipment worn by a person or items used by a person which are deemed to be the last line of defence against a residual risk created by a hazard whatever that hazard is. So when we talk about a residual risk, we're referring to the last line of defence associated to the hierarchy of controls. And some examples of our personal protective equipment that may be required is protective clothing, head protection, gloves, footwear, garments that we wear on our body, skin protection, which could also be gloves and maybe barrier creams, and fall arrest, safety harnesses and equipment so that we don't fall from working at height, hearing protection to defend us from noise, respiratory protection, where we may have to wear masks or other types of respiratory requirements to minimise the impact on our health. Other breathing apparatus that may be required, compressed air for example, in self-contained areas. And eye protection is another example. Safety glasses, goggles and face shields. It's important that the personal protective equipment is deemed to be necessary as the last line of defence in our hierarchy of controls, and therefore it's important to recognise that we want to try and remove or minimise those hazards as much as possible in order that the PPE may not be needed. However, where the PPE is the last line of defence and must be used, it should be derived based on the risk assessment undertaken for the task at hand. It should identify any exposure limits or critical timelines, and it must be compatible to the individual and the work environment. An employer must supply the PPE to any of its employees that are exposed to the risk and ensure the PPE is appropriate for the individual and the task at hand. And they must ensure that there is a regime of inspection and replacement of PPE as required. And importantly, they must provide the necessary training for their employees on how they should use and inspect the PPE before use. Of course, as an employee, there are also PPE duties under the law, that we must use the PPE in accordance with the information that is provided to us by our employer and other guiding parties. And we must report any defect or concern associated to the PPE and stop the activity we're doing. It is important also that we must use the PPE and not cut corners in these activities. Now let's talk a little bit about safety signs and signals within the workplace. We have three main areas here: prohibition, caution and mandatory. Prohibition are really the signs that say to us that we have to stop, we have to shut down and we have to take immediate action. Caution is giving us caution so that we are raised with awareness associated to possibly hazards in the workplace, for example a forklift in this area sign. They may also be used as a temporary measure to show obstacles that may not always be there. And of course, under the mandatory signs, these are things where we must, as part of this activity, part of the place that we're working, undertake these mandatory requirements. For example, wearing certain PPE, ensuring that fire doors are closed, for example. So we must try to understand and remember the types and purpose of the signs, follow these directions as an employee, and of course, as employers, we must give guidance to what these signs are for and the purpose they are there for. And this can form part of induction and regular health and safety awareness and communication to our workforce. Now let's talk a little bit about COSHH, control of substances hazardous to health. This is really that we want to try and put controls in place to minimise the impact of substances that could be harmful to our health, either in the short term or long term. And let's think about when we talk about the term substance. This can be any mixture of material or compound used in a workplace or arising from the work activity. So it could be an output, for example, dust, which is harmful to people's health in the form in which it occurs in that work activity. And that, remember, could also be in the storage and transportation of this material. There are duties of the employer to ensure that they carry out what is called a COSHH assessment, which is a form of hazard and risk management. And they must review it regularly, share it, and educate their employees associated to it. And best practice is to undertake the assessment of these substances and the hazards with the employees that are exposed to them. And of course, part of that assessment may identify significant control measures associated to timelines that you may be exposed, areas in which those exposures may be greater controlled, and of course any PPE requirements. The basic principles of a COSHH assessment is hazard identification, the work method, who's at risk, the likely exposure, including time and frequency, the implemented controls, the specified PPE, what emergency measures may be required associated to first aid and fire, for example, and of course, like always, they must be reviewed regularly, and where there are any changes, they must be reviewed. When they are reviewed, we must ensure that that communication is continued to make the people exposed aware of these changes. Now let's talk a little bit about noise. So noise can have a significant consequence on individuals exposed to a level that exceeds our limits. There are legal requirements around this, and we must think about what the impact could be in the short term and long term in terms of noise-induced hearing loss, tinnitus, and other types of things that can impact our well-being in the short and long term. There is a duty of the employer, first of all, to identify where there is a noise level above 85 and carry out noise assessments regularly if that is the case. And they must provide the necessary training to their employees associated to this risk so they're aware of it, and where appropriate, put control measures, engineering practices in place to reduce the noise or provide the necessary PPE. Next levels above that is that when they trigger 90 decibels, then they must take steps to reduce the noise at source. It's important that employers recognise that, and employees are aware also. There are a multitude of reduction techniques that could be used, and again we suggest using the hierarchy of controls, where engineering solutions, locations, maybe maintenance on equipment that we're using that's causing this additional noise, possibly the exposure and the enclosures that we work in are enhancing the noise. There may be ways of damping the noise or using different types of equipment, tools, before we get to the situation where the last line of defence is our PPE. Now let's think about manual handling, something that is a very regular occurrence within the workplace and again should be controlled under Health and Safety at Work Act and appropriate regulations. Manual handling can have a very significant impact on our well-being, and in particular as time goes by. This can result in sprains and strains in the short term, slip discs, but also can impact on trapped nerves and other types of long-term damage. It's also important to recognise that under manual handling activities, slips, trips and falls can be more possible to happen as well. There are duties on the employer, first of all, to avoid the manual handling operations where possible. Is there equipment or tools that can be used instead of the physical person's body? We must carry out risk assessments to see if we can, first of all, identify the hazards and minimise the risk. We want to reduce the risk to as low as reasonably practical under a LARP, and ensure that employees have received the suitable and sufficient information, instruction and training as part of manual handling. And of course, where this requires the use of equipment or tools, this must also be included. As well as that, employees have a duty of care that they must follow the practices that they have been trained to undertake as part of manual handling. They must carry out the manual handling process using the tools and equipment provided to them, and they must refer to the risk assessment and the training and controls implemented. So we must think about the type of training that may be required around manual handling. What activities should be taken, where the load itself is heavy, bulky or difficult to use or grip. We must think about the task itself. Is it something that is undertaken on a regular basis that could result in long-term impact? What about the environment that we work in? Is there enough space to undertake proper manual handling activities? Is there uneven floor or stairs that we have to master as part of this technique? We must remember to consider all potential hazards associated to the task, the load, the environment, and the individual we're asking to undertake this activity. To reduce the risk associated to manual handling, let's think about improving the workplace layout. Use equipment and tools to help. Avoid lifting where possible from the floor level. Avoid lifting above shoulder height. Shorten the carrying distances, possibly by use of trolleys and other mechanisms to move. And avoid repetitive handling of the same thing at the same activity regularly. Put in place engineering practices to prevent that. Now let's talk a little bit about working at height. So we must remember this is associated to falls from height and also falling objects from height, where you may be using these objects while working at height. And of course, they come down to, as well as that, the failure of equipment that we may use to protect us and others. So again, work at height falls under a requirement to do health and safety risk assessments. So we must remember that we have to look at the type of work, the duration of the work, the location, the environment in which this work is being undertaken, the individual themselves that is to do this work, any load requirements, and training and competence requirements. And of course, we must remember the equipment that is going to be used to protect this individual that is working at height. Also under this, we must consider, where appropriate, bringing in additional equipment that may be able to remove the task of working at height. Now let's move on to work equipment. So what do we mean by work equipment? Well, this is effectively any machinery, any appliances, apparatus or tools, whether powered or not, that we use to perform our work activity. And this could include assembly components which are arranged and controlled so that they function as a whole. There are duties of the employer to ensure, first of all, that the work equipment is suitable for the task at hand, that appropriate maintenance activities are undertaken. That includes inspection before and where appropriate after use, that user training is provided, that the individuals using this equipment using this machinery understands how to use it and what any safety measures are associated to it. They must also understand if there are any guarding or protection measures that have to be undertaken, for example, guarding on machinery and drilling, whether that be standalone or fixed guarding as part of the equipment. And remember, we have to think about isolation. Where there's an emergency situation, how an individual using this equipment will be able to access emergency stop activities and effectively remove the energy source to reduce the risk. We've got all sorts of different tools and hand tools that can be used in various job activities we take, and as employees we must also recognise that we have a duty to ensure that this equipment is maintained by us if in our possession, is inspected before use and after where appropriate, and where there is a problem identified, it must be isolated and not used, and awareness raised to replace or repair the equipment. Now let's talk a little bit about electricity. The sources of electricity, where they can come from in our workplace, the tools we use, buried services and utilities, any exposed services that we may come into impact with, and of course the generation of the sources of electricity in the work activities we do. We must think about the risks again through risk assessment associated to electrical shock, burns, and potentially even fires in the workplace. Now let's touch on transport, a big factor in many businesses. This transport may be related to forklifts and different trucks moving about inside and outside our facility, and also the vehicles that are used to transport goods and services to another place of work. We must remember that under the transport, our safety considerations under our risk assessments must look at the people we are selecting to use these transport items. Are they fit for purpose? Have they been provided with training? Have they been given the necessary compliance under supervision? What about traffic control? Do we have appropriate control inside our facility and in our surrounding area, in a yard or an outdoor parking location, to control the speed, to control the impact and the Lastly, let's talk briefly about fire hazards in the workplace. There is a requirement under the Health and Safety at Work Act and the fire regulations that we have to put the necessary precautions in place to remove potential sources of ignition, control the sources of fuel and heat within our work environments, And of course, we must, where possible, put detection and alarm systems in place where we may have to detect heat or detect smoke. And lastly, where required, we may have to give direction for fire lighting or use and direction to escape from a facility where there has been an impact on the lighting and the natural light is not suitable. We must remember there are 3 different sources to fire: heat, fuel and oxygen. And ideally what we want to do is starve the fire, cool it and smother it. Always remember you must have the relevant training to tackle a fire, and where you do not feel competent to do it and comfortable to do it, you must not do it and follow the evacuation measures. Well, thanks very much for joining this short awareness session. We've got lots of other videos, free information available to you. I would love it if you subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on LinkedIn. Thank you.